In the autumn of 2005, a seasoned fisherman named Jacob Vance steered his vessel, the North Star, into a wall of dense Lake Superior fog and never returned. For 10 years, his story was a cautionary tale whispered in the taverns of his small harbor town, another life claimed by the lake's unpredictable moods. He was a ghost, a memory preserved in a fading photograph on a dusty mantelpiece. But in the late summer of 2015, the North Star drifted back into view, its hull scarred by a decade of submerged silence. The empty boat wouldn't just reopen a cold case, it would dredge up a dark conspiracy that had been festering just beneath the surface of the town's quiet life, proving that while the lake is deep, the secrets of men can be deeper still. The morning of October 12, 2005, dawned with a deceptive calm. The sky over the harbor was the color of slate, and the waters of Lake Superior were placid, almost glassy, reflecting the muted tones of the coming dawn. Jacob Vance stood on the deck of the North Star, the scent of cold water and diesel fumes, a familiar comfort. He was a man etched by the elements, his face a roadmap of his years on the water, his hands calloused and strong. He was not a man of many words, preferring the company of the wind and the waves to the idle chatter of the town. His son, Leo, then a boy of 16, had helped him load the last of the gear, the quiet rhythm of their movements, a language all its own. There was no premonition, no sense of impending finality. It was just another Tuesday, another day to earn a living from the vast, unforgiving expanse that was their backyard. Around 7 in the morning, Jacob untied the lines, the low thrum of the boat's engine cutting through the morning stillness. He gave a final, brief wave to Leo, a gesture that would replay in his son's mind 1,000 times over the next decade. Then he steered the North Star out of the harbor, a solitary figure against the immense backdrop of the lake, heading for the deep waters where the best catches were found. An hour into his journey, the weather turned. A fog bank, thick and unnervingly sudden, rolled in from the north, swallowing the horizon whole. It was a common occurrence on Superior, a lake notorious for its mercurial temperament, but this fog was different. It was absolute, a suffocating white void that erased the line between water and sky. The last radio contact came at 8:04 a.m. Jacob's voice, calm and steady over the crackle, reported a good catch, but noted the deteriorating visibility. He said he would be heading back sooner than planned. That was the last anyone ever heard from him. When he failed to return by nightfall, the worry that had been simmering in his family's home began to boil over into a quiet panic. The lake, which had provided their livelihood, now seemed a malevolent entity, jealously guarding its secrets within its cold, dark depths. The subsequent search was swift but futile, a small human effort against an impossibly large and indifferent wilderness. The Coast Guard dispatched cutters and a helicopter, their searchlights cutting pathetic cones into the oppressive darkness and fog. Local fishermen, men who knew Jacob, who respected his skill and his silence, joined the effort without hesitation, their boats crisscrossing the gray water, their calls echoing unanswered across the waves. They were a tight-knit community, bound by the shared risks of their trade, and the loss of one was a wound felt by all. The search continued for 5 days, a grueling, hope-draining exercise in the face of overwhelming odds. The fog persisted for the first 2 days, a constant, blinding obstacle that turned the vast lake into an infinite series of small, isolated spaces. When it finally lifted, it revealed nothing but an endless expanse of cold, choppy water. They found no debris, no oil slick, no sign of the North Star or the man who captained her. It was as if the lake had simply opened up and swallowed them whole, leaving no trace, no evidence of the struggle. The official investigation, led by the local sheriff, a man named Miller who had held the post for 2 decades, was brief and conclusive. He declared it a tragic accident, a case of a seasoned fisherman caught unawares by a sudden storm front hidden within the fog. He spoke of rogue waves and the lake's treacherous currents, painting a picture of a brave man overwhelmed by the forces of nature. The town accepted this narrative, for it was a familiar one. They had lost fathers, sons, and brothers to the lake before. It was the price they paid for living on its shores. The search was officially called off, the case closed. Jacob Vance was presumed dead, his body committed to the cold, silent abyss. For his family, the official declaration was a hollow, meaningless formality. The absence of a body, of any wreckage, meant the absence of closure. Jacob's wife, Elena, seemed to wither, the light in her eyes dimming with each passing day. Leo, thrust into manhood overnight, was left to navigate his grief in a house suddenly filled with an unbearable silence, the ghost of his father present in every room, in every tool left in the garage, in the empty space at the dinner table. He stood on the shore for hours, staring out at the water, a silent vigil that offered no comfort, no answers, only the relentless, mocking rhythm of the waves. The town mourned in its own stoic way, with lowered flags and quiet condolences, and then, as it always did, it moved on. The lake demanded resilience, and life, like the tides, had to continue. But for the Vance family, time had stopped on that foggy October morning. They were trapped in a state of suspended grief, haunted by the question that the vast, silent lake refused to answer: what really happened to Jacob Vance and the North Star? The years that followed were a slow, grinding erosion of hope. For a decade, Jacob Vance remained a ghost, his name etched onto a small memorial plaque in a town square, alongside the others lost to the lake. The North Star became a legend, a ghost ship that some swore they saw on foggy nights, its silhouette a dark omen on the horizon. Life in the small harbor town of Port Blossom continued its unhurried pace, the rhythm of the seasons dictated by the whims of the Great Lake. But for Leo Vance, the past was a constant, tangible presence. He had watched his mother, Elena, fade away, her health deteriorating under the weight of an unresolved grief until she passed away 3 years after Jacob's disappearance. Her death left Leo truly alone, the sole inheritor of his family's sorrow and the unanswered questions that surrounded his father's last voyage. He stayed in the small house by the harbor, the house his father had built, unable to leave the place that was both a shrine to his memory and the epicenter of his own personal tragedy. He took a job as a mechanic, his hands, like his father's, becoming skilled and calloused. But he was a man divided. Part of him lived in the present, fixing engines and paying bills, while the other part remained trapped in 2005, a 16-year-old boy perpetually scanning the horizon, waiting for a boat that would never return. He never accepted the official story. His father was too skilled, too cautious, his respect for the lake too profound to be caught by a simple squall. There was a missing piece, a detail that nagged at the edge of his consciousness, a feeling that the town's collective forgetting was a willed act, a conspiracy of silence to bury a truth too uncomfortable to face. The town itself seemed to collude in this forgetting. People avoided talking about Jacob Vance, their eyes shifting away whenever his name was mentioned. The easy narrative of a tragic accident had become an accepted truth, a convenient way to smooth over the jagged edges of a mystery. Even the retired sheriff, Miller, who now spent his days fishing off the pier, would bristle at any suggestion that the case was anything other than closed. It was a story the town had told itself for so long that it had become real, and Leo's quiet refusal to believe it made him an outsider, a living reminder of a wound they all preferred to believe had healed. Then, on a bright, windswept afternoon in August of 2015, the past came drifting back. A pair of kayakers, exploring a remote, uninhabited stretch of coastline miles north of Port Blossom, stumbled upon it. Tucked away in a rocky cove, half submerged in the shallows, was the ghost. A fishing boat, its paint peeled away by years underwater, its hull covered in a thick coat of algae and rust, its name barely legible but unmistakable on the transom, the North Star. The news spread through Port Blossom like a wildfire, crackling with a mixture of shock, awe, and a palpable sense of dread. The ghost ship had returned. For the town, it was a chilling relic from a forgotten tragedy. For Leo Vance, it was a miracle. It was the physical proof he had always needed, the tangible link to the past that could finally force the town and the law to confront the questions they had so diligently ignored for 10 long years. The discovery of the boat was a beginning, not an end. It was a promise that the secrets the lake had held for a decade were about to be dredged into the harsh light of day. The return of the North Star galvanized the state authorities into action, reopening a case that had been dormant for a decade. The local sheriff's department, now under new leadership, was deemed too close to the original, flawed investigation. The case was handed over to the state's cold case unit, and with it came Detective Isabella Rossi. Rossi was an outsider in every sense of the word. She was a city cop, sharp, methodical, and immune to the unspoken rules and veiled histories of a small town like Port Blossom. She arrived with a cool, detached professionalism that was immediately at odds with the town's insular, emotionally charged atmosphere. Her first act was to have the North Star painstakingly recovered and transported to a secure forensic facility, treating the derelict vessel not as a tragic relic, but as a 10-year-old crime scene. She met Leo Vance in the sterile environment of the facility, the ghost ship looming behind a plastic curtain. She saw in his eyes not just grief, but a decade of frustration and a fierce, burning need for the truth. He handed her a box of his father's old files, newspaper clippings from 2005, and a map where he had obsessively tracked the futile search efforts. "They called it an accident," Leo said, his voice quiet but firm. "My father didn't have accidents, not on that lake." Rossi listened without interruption, her gaze analytical. She made no promises, offered no comforting platitudes. She simply absorbed the information, her mind already working, connecting the dots that old Sheriff Miller had so conveniently ignored. The boat itself began to tell a story that contradicted the official narrative. The forensic team, under Rossi's meticulous direction, went over every inch of the scarred hull. They found that the damage was inconsistent with a storm. There were deep gouges along the port side, scrapes of a paint color not used on the North Star, suggesting a collision. More damningly, they discovered a series of small, uniform holes drilled just below the waterline, a clear and deliberate act of scuttling. Someone hadn't just been caught in a storm, they had tried to sink this boat and make it disappear forever. But the most significant discovery came from a place no one would have thought to look. While examining the captain's small, cramped cabin, a technician noticed an anomaly in the wall behind the bunk. A section of the wood paneling was subtly different. Prying it open, they found a small, hidden compartment, insulated and waterproof. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound logbook. It was Jacob Vance's personal log, his last entries written in a steady hand, chronicling the final hours of his life. The pages were a testament to his methodical nature, detailing wind speed, water temperature, and catch counts. But the final entry, dated October 12, 2005, was chillingly different. The neat, precise script became a rushed scrawl, the words filled with a sense of urgency and fear. He wrote of seeing another boat near the remote, uninhabited islet known as Serpent's Rock, a place most fishermen avoided due to its treacherous shoals. He described it as a shadow operation, something happening under the cover of the fog. He wrote that he saw them, that he was recognized. The last, hastily written line was a name and a warning. Thorne, the harbor master. It's not what it looks like. He knows I saw. The logbook transformed the investigation. This was no longer a case of a missing fisherman. It was a murder. Detective Rossi now held the first words from Jacob Vance in a decade. A voice from the grave pointing a trembling finger directly at the heart of Port Blossom's small, tight-knit community. The truth had a name, and his name was Thorne. The logbook was the key, the Rosetta Stone that began to translate the coded silence of Port Blossom. Detective Rossi felt the familiar thrill of a case breaking open, the cold certainty that she was on the right path. She focused her attention on Harbor Master Thorne, a man who had held his position for over 30 years. He was a pillar of the community, a gruff but seemingly benevolent figure who controlled the lifeblood of the town, its harbor. When Rossi brought him in for an informal interview, he was the picture of civic concern, offering his condolences to Leo and praising Jacob as a fine fisherman lost too soon. But when Rossi mentioned Serpent's Rock, a flicker of something, unease, anger crossed his face before being quickly suppressed. He claimed to have been in his office all day on October 12, 2005, buried in paperwork, a story the old case file, signed by Sheriff Miller, dutifully corroborated. He dismissed the logbook entry as the confused ramblings of a man facing a storm, a desperate attempt to make sense of a disorienting situation. His denial was smooth, practiced, but Rossi saw the cracks in the facade. She knew he was lying. Her next visit was to the retired Sheriff Miller. She found him on his porch, a paunchy, sun-weathered man who radiated a sense of territorial ownership over the town's past. He was immediately hostile, his folksy demeanor dissolving into undisguised resentment. "You're stirring up trouble where there is none," Miller grumbled, refusing to look her in the eye. "It was an accident. The lake took him. Sometimes that's all the answer there is." He defended Thorne vehemently, calling him a town institution, a man beyond reproach. He dismissed the new evidence from the boat as inconclusive, the result of 10 years at the bottom of a lake. But his defensiveness was too strong, his loyalty to Thorne too absolute. Rossi realized she wasn't just investigating a murder, she was confronting a cover-up. The two men, Thorne and Miller, were connected, their stories interwoven to protect a shared secret. While Rossi navigated the official channels, Leo Vance began his own quiet, parallel investigation, plumbing the depths of his own memory and the town's hushed history. The name Thorne from the logbook had unlocked a flood of forgotten details. He remembered his father in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, a shadow of anxiety clinging to him. He recalled heated, whispered arguments on the pier between his father and the harbor master, conversations that would abruptly stop whenever Leo approached. At the time, he had dismissed it as the usual friction of a working harbor. Now, he saw it as something far more sinister. He started talking to the old-timers, the retired fishermen who frequented the waterfront diner. At first, they were reluctant, their answers evasive, their eyes darting towards the door. The wall of silence was still strong. But Leo was one of them, Jacob Vance's son, and his quiet, persistent grief began to wear down their defenses. An old, rheumy-eyed fisherman named Silas, a man who had been a friend of his father's, finally broke. He spoke in a low, conspiratorial whisper, recounting how Thorne's power in the harbor was absolute. He controlled mooring rights, fuel prices, and access to the best fishing grounds. He had a reputation for rewarding his friends and making life difficult for those who crossed him. Silas spoke of a night crew, a group of Thorne's loyalists who would take their boats out at odd hours, their holds suspiciously empty on the way out and heavy on the way back. No one asked questions. It was an unspoken rule of survival in Port Blossom. "Your father," Silas said, his voice heavy with regret, "he was a straight arrow. He didn't like what he was seeing. He started asking questions. In this town, that's a dangerous thing to do." Leo brought this information to Rossi. It corroborated the logbook's mention of a shadow operation. A picture was becoming clearer. Thorne was running an illicit enterprise from the harbor, and Jacob Vance had discovered it. The collision, the scuttling of the boat. It wasn't an act of panic in a storm. It was a deliberate, cold-blooded execution, and the first step in a carefully orchestrated cover-up. A cover-up sanctioned and enabled by the town's highest-ranking lawman. The investigation was now a two-front war. Rossi attacked the official records, while Leo chipped away at the wall of communal silence. Together, they were dragging a decade-old secret out of the depths, and the town was beginning to tremble under the strain. Detective Rossi knew that anecdote and memory were not enough to break a conspiracy. She needed hard, irrefutable evidence. She began a deep dive into the financial histories of Harbor Master Thorne and retired Sheriff Miller, requesting a decade's worth of bank statements, property records, and tax returns. The paper trail, she knew, would be less susceptible to intimidation than the town's frightened fishermen. The records told a damning story. In the years immediately following Jacob Vance's disappearance, both Thorne and Miller had experienced a significant, unexplained increase in their personal wealth. Thorne had purchased a large tract of waterfront property, paying in cash. Miller, on a modest sheriff's salary, had managed to pay off his mortgage and acquire a new, expensive fishing boat, also with cash. These were not the financial footprints of small-town public servants. They were the signs of men profiting from a hidden, lucrative enterprise. Rossi cross-referenced the dates of large cash deposits with shipping manifests and harbor records from 2005. She discovered a pattern of discrepancies. Certain cargo shipments, listed as mundane goods like machine parts or fertilizer, were logged by Thorne at weights far exceeding their declared contents. These shipments often coincided with the night crew, excursions Silas had told Leo about. The shadow operation was a smuggling ring, using the legitimate fishing industry of Port Blossom as a front to move high-value, untaxed goods across the Canadian border, a mere few hours' journey across the lake. Thorne was the logistical mastermind, and Miller was his insurance policy, the lawman who guaranteed no one would ever look too closely. Jacob Vance, with his intimate knowledge of the lake's hidden coves and his unwavering moral compass, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He hadn't just stumbled upon a single illicit transaction at Serpent's Rock, he had uncovered the entire operation. His death was not a crime of passion, it was a calculated business decision, a necessary measure to protect a profitable criminal enterprise. The evidence was now overwhelming, but Rossi still needed a direct witness to the events of that day. She knew the fear that Thorne and Miller had instilled in the community was still a powerful deterrent. She decided to pay another visit to Silas, the old fisherman. This time, she brought Leo with her. They found him mending nets in his small, cluttered shed, the air thick with the smell of brine and old rope. At first, he was terrified, shaking his head, refusing to say more. But seeing Leo, the spitting image of his father, standing there, his face a mask of quiet determination, seemed to break something in the old man. The guilt of his 10 years' silence finally became a heavier burden than his fear. With tears welling in his eyes, Silas confessed. He had been on the water that morning, farther out than usual. He saw it all. He saw Thorne's boat, the Sea Serpent, aggressively closing in on the North Star in the fog near Serpent's Rock. He saw the confrontation, the collision. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the struggle. He saw Jacob fall. He saw Thorne and his men pull Jacob's lifeless body from the water. He was paralyzed by fear. He turned his boat around and fled, his heart pounding in his chest. A few days later, Sheriff Miller had paid him a visit. The sheriff hadn't made an overt threat. He didn't have to. He just sat in Silas's kitchen, talking about the dangers of the lake, about how easy it was for a man to have an accident, for a boat to be lost. The message was clear. Silence was survival. With Silas's eyewitness account, the case was finally sealed. Rossi now had the motive, the means, the evidence, and the witness. The conspiracy of silence that had held Port Blossom in its grip for a decade was about to be shattered by the testimony of one old, frightened fisherman who had finally decided to tell the truth. The net was closing around Thorne and Miller, and Detective Rossi knew it was time to pull it tight. She could feel the shift in the town's atmosphere. The fear was still present, but it was now mingled with a current of angry anticipation. The return of the North Star had not just brought back a ghost, it had reawakened the town's dormant conscience. Rossi understood that Thorne was a man who thrived on control, and as his control slipped, he would become desperate and predictable. She anticipated he would try to silence the two people who posed the greatest threat to him, Silas, the witness, and Leo, the catalyst. She put both men under discreet 24-hour surveillance. Her instincts proved correct. 2 nights after her meeting with Silas, the surveillance team watching the old fisherman's shed reported movement. A dark vehicle without its headlights on had parked down the road. A figure emerged, moving stealthily through the shadows towards the shed. It was Thorne, but he wasn't alone. With him was a man Rossi recognized from harbor security footage as one of the night crew. They were carrying something heavy, a canister of some kind. They were not there to talk. They were there to erase the evidence, to silence Silas permanently by setting his home ablaze. Rossi gave the signal, and the tactical team moved in. The night erupted in a chaos of shouted commands and blinding lights. Thorne and his accomplice were caught completely off guard, apprehended before they could ignite the gasoline. Thorne, stripped of his power and authority, seemed to shrink before her eyes, his face a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. With Thorne in custody, Rossi immediately moved on Miller. She found the retired sheriff at his home, calmly reading the newspaper on his porch, a pathetic caricature of a man at peace. The moment he saw Rossi's car, flanked by 2 state police cruisers, the facade crumbled. His face went pale. His hands trembled. He knew the game was over. He offered no resistance as he was placed under arrest. The man who was once the ultimate authority in Port Blossom, now just another aging criminal facing the consequences of his long-buried crimes. The interrogation of Harbor Master Thorne was brief and brutal. Faced with Silas's signed testimony, the financial records, the forensic evidence from the boat, and his own foiled arson attempt, he had nowhere left to hide. He confessed. His account was chilling in its banality. It was, as Rossi had suspected, a business decision. Jacob had seen them unloading a shipment at Serpent's Rock. He knew what it was and who was involved. He had confronted Thorne on the water. He was a good man, Thorne said, his voice devoid of any real emotion. But he was stubborn. He wouldn't listen to reason. He was going to ruin everything. There had been a struggle, and in the ensuing chaos, one of Thorne's men struck Jacob with a gaff hook. He fell overboard, his head hitting the gunwale of his own boat. He was likely dead before he hit the water. They pulled his body from the lake, weighted it down, and sent it to the bottom of Superior's icy depths. Then they tried to scuttle the North Star, drilling holes in the hull and letting it sink into the fog-shrouded water. They believed it would be lost forever, just another casualty of the lake. Miller's role was to ensure the official story held, to quash any rumors, and to intimidate anyone, like Silas, who might have seen something. For 10 years, their secret had held, preserved by fear and the town's willingness to accept a simpler, less painful truth. The confession was a final, ugly chapter in a story that had haunted Port Blossom for a decade. The arrests of Thorne and Miller sent shockwaves through the community, a seismic event that cracked the very foundations of the town's identity. The men they had trusted, the institutions they had relied upon, were rotten to the core. The news was a maelstrom of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. But for Leo Vance, it was a moment of profound, deafening silence. The truth he had sought for so long was finally his. He had an answer, a name, a reason. He had justice. But as he stood outside the state police barracks, the confession echoing in his mind, he felt a hollow victory. The truth had not brought his father back. It had not erased the 10 years of grief, of waiting, of watching his mother fade away. It was just a story, a sordid tale of greed and murder. The mystery was solved, but the wound remained. The aftermath was a slow, painful reckoning for the town of Port Blossom. The trials of Thorne, his crew, and former Sheriff Miller were a public spectacle, laying bare the corruption that had festered beneath the town's picturesque surface. Thorne was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Jacob Vance. Miller received a lengthy sentence for obstruction of justice and his role in the criminal conspiracy. The night crew received varying sentences for their involvement in the smuggling ring. The town was forced to look at itself in a harsh, unflattering light to confront the uncomfortable truth that their collective silence had made them complicit. For Leo Vance, life settled into a new, unfamiliar rhythm. The obsessive quest that had defined his existence for a decade was over. The anger and the need for answers had been replaced by a vast, quiet sorrow. He sold his father's house, the house by the harbor that was filled with too many ghosts. He stayed in Port Blossom, continuing his work as a mechanic, finding a strange solace in the logic and order of machinery, a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined his life. He was no longer the town's haunted son, but he remained a solitary figure, a man marked by his past. In the end, the story belonged to the lake. Lake Superior, in its vast, unknowable power, had been the sole keeper of the truth. It had held the North Star in its depths for a decade, and then, for reasons of its own, a shift in the currents, a change in the seasons. It had given the boat back. It had returned the one piece of evidence that could not be intimidated, that could not be bribed, that could not be silenced. One cool autumn evening, a year after the trials had concluded, Leo walked down to the end of the old pier. He stood for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the water in hues of orange and purple. The lake was calm, its surface like dark glass. It looked peaceful, serene, but he knew better. He knew of the violence and the secrets it held in its cold, dark heart. The mystery of his father's death was solved, but the greater mystery, the one embodied by the immense body of water before him, remained. The lake kept its own counsel. It had given him an answer, but it had not given him peace. And as the last light faded from the sky, leaving him in the growing darkness, Leo understood that some ghosts never leave. They just become a part of the landscape.